Chapter 12, An Age of Reform, 1820 to 1840, Parts 1 and 2. Part 1, The Reform Impulse. Abolitionism was one of many antebellum efforts to reform American society. Lacking a powerful national government, Americans' political and social activities were organized through tens of thousands of voluntary associations, such as churches, fraternal orders, and political clubs. Americans established groups to prevent the making and selling of liquor, end public entertainments and mail delivery on Sunday, improve prisons, expand public education, improve working conditions, and reorganize society on a cooperative rather than competitive basis. Most of these groups worked to convert public opinion in their favor. They lectured, petitioned, and published pamphlets. Many reformers confronted more than one issue. While some reform campaigns flourished through the nation, others, like labor reform and abolitionism, never took hold in the South. Reform was international, and many groups created ties with reformers in Europe. Reformers tried a variety of tactics, from moral suasion to using government power to force changes in others' behavior. Some reformers withdrew from society altogether and established their own communities. While never a majority, reformers significantly influenced American politics and society. About 100 reform communities were established before the Civil War. These utopian communities varied in structure and motivation. Some were governed by a charismatic leader, others were democratic. Most were religiously motivated, but some had secular origins and desires to reverse social and economic changes unleashed by the market revolution. Nearly all of these communities sought to make society cooperative, restoring social harmony in an increasingly individualistic society and closing the widening gap between rich and poor. Their efforts to own productive property communally rather than as a private individual introduced socialism and communism into America's political language. Most utopian communities also attempted in some way to transform traditional gender roles and marriage patterns, insisting that the abolition of private property must be matched by the abolition of man's property in women. The Shakers were the most successful of the religious utopians, and at their height in the 1840s they had settlements from Maine to Kentucky totaling 5,000 members. Founded in the late 18th century by Mother Ann Lee, a British emigrant claiming to be directed by God, the Shakers believed that men and women were spiritual equals and that their work was equally important. They eschewed traditional families. Men and women abstained from sex and lived separately in communal dorms. They were called Shakers for their religious services, which include frenzied dancing. Though they rejected private property, the Shakers found economic success by marketing plant seeds, breeding cattle, and making furniture. Another influential group was the Mormons, the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith, claiming to have found the ancient tablets which he had transcribed as the Book of Mormon, founded the church in the late 1820s in upstate New York. His absolute authority over his followers and Mormons' refusal to separate church and state alarmed many, as did their practice of a polygamous marriage, in which one man could have more than one wife. The Mormons were persecuted and driven from state to state until Mormon leader Brigham Young led more than 10,000 Mormons to the shores of the Great Salt Lake in modern-day Utah. The case of the Mormons showed the limits of religious toleration in 19th century America. Oneida, founded in 1848 in upstate New York by John Humphrey Noyes, was also influential. Noyes, having become an evangelical preacher, preached that he and his followers had achieved moral perfection and were free of sin. He first founded a community in Putney, Vermont, where private property was abolished and complex marriage practiced. In his system of complex marriage, any man could propose sexual relations with any woman, who was free to accept or reject the invitation. Tried for adultery, he left Vermont and founded Oneida, a dictatorial community ruled by himself, in which an early form of eugenics was practiced. This lasted until about 1881. Religious utopian communities, with their spiritual devotion, strong leaders, and undemocratic governance, tended to last longer than secular utopian communities, which often failed due to internal strife. One notable secular community was Brook Farm, founded by New England transcendentalists in 1841 near Boston. They hoped to show that manual and intellectual labor could coexist and modeled their community on the ideas of Charles Fourier, a French social reformer who planned communities with communal living and working, but private property for individuals. His settlements, called phalanxes, were planned to the last detail. Brook Farm became a salon of sorts, attracting ministers, writers, and teachers until residents' dislike for farm labor caused it to disband after a few years. The most important secular communitarian was Robert Owen, a British industrialist who was appalled by early industrial conditions and built a model textile factory town at Newlyn Ark in Scotland. In 1824, he purchased Harmony, a utopian religious community in Ohio founded earlier in the 19th century by a German Protestant, George Rapp. Here, Owen established New Harmony. Owen envisioned a society in which all children would receive education, women would have equal rights, including access to education and divorce rights, and property would be held in common. But divisions at New Harmony led to its dissolution after a few years. Owenism influenced the early labor movement, educational reform, and women's rights advocates. Other secular communities included Utopia, Ohio, and Modern Times, New York, founded by anarchist Josiah Warren, who believed that all institutions that exercise power over individuals are illegitimate. Most Americans saw private property as the basis of economic independence and freedom, and marriage as the basis of the social order, so they were unlikely to join these utopian communities. More typical of the reform impulse were movements directed to freeing men and women from external restraints, such as slavery, or from personal behavior, such as drinking or criminality. Many of these movements were inspired by the religious revivalism of the Second Great Awakening, which encouraged people to believe that sinners were free moral agents who could reform and perfect both themselves and the world. One such movement was temperance, which had its origin in the North's emerging middle-class culture and its search for respectability through individual self-control. Founded in 1826, the American Temperance Society tried to convince Americans to stop drinking altogether. In the 1830s, the society claimed to have helped hundreds of thousands to stop drinking liquor. But temperance invited great hostility from many Americans who resented others' efforts to change their behaviors, which they thought were no less moral than that of the temperate. Many Americans saw reform as an assault on their own freedoms. Drinking was prominent at everyday celebrations and events. Taverns were popular meeting places for working men and sites of political discussions, organizational meetings, and popular recreation. American Catholics, in particular the Irish and German immigrants, often opposed reform efforts. Unlike Protestant reformers, they viewed sin as inevitable in society and individuals, and they viewed the belief that the world could be perfected as irreligious and productive of reformers' attempts to impose their own worldview on others. Catholics tended to place less emphasis on the individual as a free moral agent and emphasized communities centered on family and the church. Reformers faced a contradiction between their hopes to establish a moral order and expand personal freedom. Their notion of freedom was both liberating and controlling. They said their goal was to help Americans enjoy genuine liberty by liberating them from the slavery of drink, poverty, and sin. Yet they believed that self-fulfillment derived from self-discipline and that the free individual fully practiced self-control. Reformers worried that Western settlers and immigrants lacked self-control and required either private reform groups or the government to change their behaviors. Reform efforts created a multitude of new institutions designed to transform individuals into free, morally upright citizens, performing services once rendered in the family or small community. In the 1830s and 40s, Americans built jails for criminals, asylums for the mentally ill, and orphanages. These institutions emerged for reformers' belief that social ills could be cured and eliminated by placing individuals in an environment where their character could be changed. Reformers hoped to remake the afflicted into productive, self-disciplined citizens. The most significant institution-building effort before the Civil War was the move to establish common schools, tax-supported state school systems open to all children. In the early 19th century, most children were educated, if at all, in local schools, private academies, or at home. Many children had no access to education. Horace Mann, a Massachusetts lawyer and Whig politician, led efforts to create new common schools. Mann embraced industrialization, but hoped that universal public education would restore social equality by bringing children from all social classes together and giving them an equal opportunity for upward social mobility. Mann also insisted that schools would stabilize society by disciplining children and building individual character, teaching obedience to authority and adherence to strict time periods. With support from labor unions, factory owners, and middle-class reformers, by 1860, every northern state had tax-supported school systems for children. The South, where planters did not want to be taxed to support the education of poor white children, only slowly developed public schools. Part 2. The Crusade Against Slavery. Compared to drinking, Sabbath breaking, and illiteracy, the greatest evil in American society first attracted the least attention from reformers. For decades, the only criticism of slavery seemed to come from Quakers, slaves, and free blacks. Before the 1830s, most white Americans who called for the abolition of slavery also supported the colonization of free slaves or their deportation to Africa, the Caribbean, or Central America. In 1816, supporters of this idea founded the American Colonization Society, which promoted the gradual abolition of slavery and the settlement of black Americans in Africa. It soon established Liberia on the coast of West Africa, to which some free blacks did emigrate. Even though many saw colonization as impractical, prominent political leaders in the Jacksonian era, such as Henry Clay, John Marshall, Daniel Webster, and even Jackson, supported the Colonization Society. Many in the North saw colonization as the only means of ending slavery, while Southern colonizationists urged free blacks, whom they regarded a degraded group that endangered white society, to leave the country. Others simply thought racism so entrenched that it was safer for blacks, once freed, to leave the nation. Colonization rested on the premise that America was fundamentally a white society. Of course, while several thousand free blacks did migrate to Liberia, most African Americans opposed the idea of colonization and argued that as Americans, they had the right to remain in the United States as free and equal citizens. The abolitionist movement of the 1830s arose in opposition to colonization and its supporters. The new abolitionists drew on the religious idea that slavery was a sin and a secular commitment to the values of the Declaration of Independence. They rejected gradual emancipation and demanded that immediate abolition of slavery happen. They vociferously criticized slavery and slaveholders and affirmed that blacks, once freed, should become equal citizens of the Republic and not colonizers of distant lands. While white abolitionists were hardly free of racism, they demanded that race should not prevent the equal enjoyment of economic, civil, and political rights in the United States. They opposed racism in all its forms. The first sign of this new abolitionism was an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, an 1829 pamphlet written by David Walker, a free black in Boston. Walker called on black Americans to mobilize for abolition, with arms if necessary, and warned Americans that God would punish them if they did not end slavery. Walker invoked the Bible and the Declaration of Independence, but he also asked blacks to take pride in African civilization's achievements and claimed their rights as Americans. Though Walker's pamphlet alarmed many in the North and South, he soon died under mysterious circumstances. Only with the appearance in 1831 of The Liberator, the weekly journal of Bostonian William Lloyd Garrison, did the new abolitionism take root. Garrison was strident in his rhetoric and unbending in his commitment to abolition. Garrison even suggested that the North should abrogate the Constitution and dissolve the Union in order to end its complicity with slavery. While few abolitionists supported this notion, many adopted his criticisms of colonization and called for immediate abolition. The abolitionist movement quickly spread from a handful of activists to thousands of villages, towns, and cities throughout the North. They took advantage of new print technology and expanding literacy by printing and distributing enormous amounts of pamphlets, newspapers, books, novels, and broadsides. Between the formation of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 and 1840, about 100,000 Northerners joined local abolition groups. Most were ordinary citizens, although a few prominent men, like local New York merchants Arthur and Lewis Tappan, also joined. Theodore Weld, an evangelical minister, helped create a mass constituency for abolition by using the methods of the revivalists, calling slavery a sin which could only be resolved by immediate abolition. While many Southerners believed the abolitionists hoped to incite a slave insurrection, nearly all abolitionists, despite their militant rhetoric, rejected violence as a means of ending slavery. Many were pacifists, or non-resistants, who believed that coercion had to be eliminated from all human institutions and relationships. They adopted the strategy of moral suasion, or convincing slaveholders to end their sinful ways and shaming Northerners into action. Abolitionists were the first in American history to try to transform society by changing mass opinion through education and agitation instead of using political parties. Abolitionism both reaffirmed and challenged common understandings of freedom in the Jacksonian America. It helped spread the notion, reinforced by the market revolution, that personal freedom derived not from ownership of productive property such as land, but from ownership of oneself and the ability to enjoy the fruits of one's labor. Abolitionists rejected that ideas of wage slavery popularized by the labor movement. They argued that compared to the slave, the wage worker embodied freedom, since he could change jobs, accumulate property, and have a stable family. Yet, Abolitionists argued that slavery was so entrenched in American life that its destruction would require fundamental changes in both North and South. They demanded that the inherent, natural, and absolute right to a personal liberty, regardless of race, should take precedence over other freedoms, such as the right to accumulate and maintain property or the right to self-government by local political communities. The abolitionists tried to reassert that freedom was a universal entitlement in an age when freedom and citizenship had become associated with whiteness. The idea that Americans could be a single people undifferentiated by race has its origins with the abolitionists, not the Founding Fathers. Anti-slavery activists viewed slaves and free blacks as equal members of the national community. They argued that birthplace, not race, should determine who was an American, which is an idea that was later enshrined in the 14th Amendment. They were the first to argue that human rights were more important than national sovereignty, and they urged enforcement of international laws against the slave trade and slavery. While some abolitionists like Garrison detested the Constitution as a covenant with slave owners, others, like Frederick Douglass, believed that it offered no protections to slavery. But abolitionists invented the concept of equality before the law, regardless of race, and they consciously presented abolition as the culmination of the Revolution's values of liberty and equality.